No matter who the prime minister is in Israel, evangelicals will line up and support that leader, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the leader of Israel, it's about the nation of Israel.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. It's my pleasure to bring to you this week Erick Stakelbeck, who is news director for TBN, the world's largest Christian TV network, as well as the host for the Watchman show. Erick has spent 2 decades covering the Middle East and national security issues in depth, traveling to the region and highlighting the shared threats to America and Israel. He's the author of 3 best-selling books, including The Terrorist Next Door, The Brotherhood, and ISIS Exposed. Join me now. Erick Stakelbeck, it's an honor to have you with us on Global Perspectives.
Ellie, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So I want to jump right in. Israel's recent ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, recently in an interview said that Israel should prioritize the evangelical Christian community because of their, quote, passionate and unequivocal support of Israel. And he received some heat from the American Jewish community for that statement. What's your assessment? Is Ambassador Ron Dermer correct in his statement?
I think he is correct, Ellie, in that, look, the evangelical community of the United States, obviously a bulwark of support for Israel, but I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive in terms of alienating the Jewish community in the United States. I don't think Ambassador Dermer meant that. I just think that he meant, look, greater emphasis on the evangelical community in the U.S. is just plain common sense. Think back, Ellie, to even the Second Intifada, where tourism in many ways was at a standstill in Israel. Evangelicals kept coming. Even during Israel's darkest hours, evangelicals were there on the ground. I can tell you that the people I speak to right now are very excited about Israel hopefully opening back up fully in the coming months and getting back on the ground. Christians here in the U.S. getting back on the ground. So I think Ambassador Dermer was onto something for sure. I can tell you from personal experience, Ellie, he was absolutely outstanding in terms of outreach to evangelicals. And there is support across political lines. That's one of the key things to remember here. When it comes to evangelicals in the U.S., no matter who the prime minister is, obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu was very popular among evangelicals here in the States and did, again, great outreach to the evangelical community. But really, no matter who the prime minister is in Israel, evangelicals will line up and support that leader, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the leader of Israel, it's about the nation of Israel.
Well, I want to ask you about that, Erick, if I may. What do you think inspires the evangelical and Christian support for the Jewish state?
Ellie, great question. I think a few things. Number one, obviously the biblical mandate. Christians, Bible-believing Christians, see the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 3, where God says, I will bless those who bless Israel, and I will curse those who curse Israel. And evangelicals take that very seriously throughout the Bible. God's promises to the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. So that is obviously 1A for evangelical support. But I think even you could take it from a purely secular perspective. A few things, Ellie. Israel's enemies and America's enemies are one and the same. The same radical forces that seek to wipe the nation of Israel off the map have a bullseye on the back of the United States, led, of course, by the Iranian regime. And then Israel, look, a lone beacon of democracy and sanity in the world's most chaotic region. I just reported, Ellie, on the potential collapse of Lebanon to Israel's north. Just another example of Israel, again, is an island of sanity in the region. You think of Israel as a booming technological, economic, scientific, high-tech powerhouse as well. So to me, it's just plain common sense, no matter where you are in terms of your faith, to stand with Israel.
You know, I can agree with you more about how the U.S. and Israeli national security interests align. I want to stay on the Christian community for one moment longer. What about evangelical millennials? You know, we're hearing more and more that we may be losing the younger generation in terms of their support for Israel.
Ellie, this is a concern for sure. The millennial generation in America and really around the world, I think in many ways, is very focused on social justice. And hey, that's a great thing on its surface. Everyone wants to have social justice, but many times, unfortunately for millennials, that means less support for Israel and more advocating for the Palestinian cause. I believe, frankly, Ellie, that there has been a lot of young people in the United States and in Europe and the West in general misled about the true nature of what goes on in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians in particular, because when I think of social justice, I think of Israel as a beacon of social justice. Look, the most diverse, possibly the most diverse nation on the planet, Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, side by side, worshiping freely in the nation of Israel. Not only that, Arabs, Arab parties as members of the Knesset, Arabs with the right to vote in Israel, and Israel always doing its best to pick up the downtrodden in the nation. So Israel, when it comes to social justice, has nothing to apologize for, and I think millennials need to be better educated on that fact, and hopefully we'll see that. There's a lot of outreach going on, but much more needs to be done.
Well, you are the host of the Watchman, which is on the most widely viewed Christian channel in the world, I believe. Can you tell me what you think you're exposing about Israel and the Middle East that the mainstream media is getting wrong?
I think a few things, Ellie. Number one, it's tough for people to grasp just how precarious Israel's security situation is. Our good friend Ron Dermer, who you just mentioned, used to say the only thing better than standing with Israel is standing in Israel, not only from a spiritual sense, but to see, I guess you would call them the limitations, the challenges that Israel is facing. This is a nation the size of the state of New Jersey, surrounded by hostile enemies practically on every border. So I think, number one, we try to drive home the point that, look, Israel is up against it, so to speak, but they are fighting the good fight as the first line of defense for the West. Again, Ellie, the same radical forces that are targeting Israel, if they got their wish and they wiped Israel off the map, and we know that's not going to happen, but if they did, where are they coming next? Israel is that first line of defense. That's one thing we drive home, and obviously the biblical heritage of Israel, how we are all affected by it. So to be on the ground in Israel, usually about 5 times a year, is a real blessing and an honor.
Well, I can't say I'm not jealous. And Eric, I want to also talk a little bit about your expertise on terrorism. You've written 2 books on terrorism and radical Islam. The first is called The Terrorist Next Door, and the older is ISIS Exposed. In your assessment, how serious is the threat of radical Islam domestically in the United States? And also, what policy prescriptions do you have for the U.S. government, therefore?
Ellie, great question. Believe it or not, I wrote a third one as well and lived to tell about it, called The Brotherhood, about the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And great question, because we focused in that book specifically on what the Brotherhood is doing here in the West, in Europe, and the United States, and the ISIS book did as well. I think a key point here, Ellie, is that President Trump kept his word. The ISIS caliphate in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, was effectively crushed. ISIS, still a threat for sure, a serious threat, but they have certainly been severely weakened. What does that mean for us here in the West? Well, back in 2013, 14, 15, 16, we had this pipeline of young Americans and young European radicalized young Muslims who were flocking to the caliphate, who were drawn to the great success that ISIS was having. Now that caliphate has been smashed. As a result, the luster is gone, so to speak. So right now we're in a very interesting period, I think, for young radicals here in the West. Again, U.S. and Europe. Al-Qaeda weakened. ISIS weakened. God forbid something else comes along the pike. My focus, in a sense, Ellie, in reporting on all of this has really shifted to the Iranian axis. I feel like that's where the story is right now. Not discounting the threat by Sunni Islamists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but Iran, with Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, various militias at its disposal, threatens not only the peace and stability of the Middle East, but the world, in my view, as it drives for a nuclear bomb. That's something ISIS could only dream of, a radical Islamic power with the world's most dangerous weapons, and Iran is at the doorstep of that capability.
Eric, just today, I think we heard announcements out of the Biden administration in their complete capitulation to the Iranian regime and continued unilateral concessions to the Iranians, which I find, frankly, just completely ironic because it's the Iranian regime that's on the verge of bankruptcy, and yet the Biden administration is sending them a lifeline. What is your assessment on that national security threat for Americans?
A complete potential disaster looming, Ellie. I'm so glad you brought that up because we basically, under the Trump administration, the United States had the Iranian regime on the ropes. As you said, sanctions, the Iranian economy in tatters, sanctions were biting and biting hard. And now the Biden administration is going to essentially let the regime off the hook, apparently going to lift sanctions and lift them very soon. The administration is hell-bent on re-entering that disastrous Iran nuclear deal. And Ellie, this comes against the backdrop, remember, of repeated attacks against U.S. service members in Iraq over the past few months. Since January 1st alone, we've had at least 55 attacks, rocket and drone attacks, carried out by Iran's proxies against U.S. personnel in Iraq. And still, the Biden White House remains at the negotiating table in Vienna, holding these indirect talks with the regime on re-entering the Iran nuclear deal. I think the first policy prescription, Ellie, is to forget about that deal for good. Walk away from the Iranian nuclear deal and never go back. Increase sanctions, tighten the hold of those sanctions. Take a tough line would be my prescription. I think we were on the right course in the previous administration. We've really gone off course, to say the least, in the past few months under the Biden White House.
Exactly right. And Eric, I'm someone who was born in Iran myself, and I've kind of been shouting from the rooftops about the Iranian threat. And of course, in the Trump administration, our administration fully understood the Iranian threat and contained it, as you said. I think many of us have given hope on the Biden administration. It seems that Republicans in Congress might be the only pathway to truly containing the Iranian threat. Do you think CUFI and the Christian community will get behind that?
I think CUFI certainly will. They've been a foremost opponent against the Iran deal for years. I remember I previously worked for CUFI, and back in 2015, as the CUFI summit was unfolding in Washington, D.C., this Iran nuclear deal was announced, and speaker after speaker got up there at the podium in front of 5,500 people at the D.C. Convention Center and blasted, rightfully so, this Iran deal. So I think certainly CUFI and other Christian organizations, pro-Israel organizations, will be at the forefront of opposing any new incarnation of that Iran deal. Ellie, think about it. Not only does it gift wrap the Iranian regime billions of dollars in sanctions relief, which will be used not to build schools and playgrounds in Tehran, but to destroy schools and playgrounds in Israel, but the deal does not include Iran's burgeoning ballistic missile program or its support for terror around the region. My question is, what do we get out of it in the United States? In any good negotiation, it's a two-way street. It seems to me the United States literally benefits not at all from the deal. And the key point, Ellie, the sunset clause. This is kicking the can down the road. What is the sunset clause? When the sun sets on the deal, say after 5 or 10 years, Iran can do whatever it wants. So kicking the can down the road and delaying the inevitable, I would say inevitable, but I do not believe, Ellie, under any circumstances that Israel, no matter who the leader in Israel is, will allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, which could fulfill its goal of wiping Israel off the map.
Yeah, the Iranian regime is certainly a genocidal one, and I think we all hope and pray that the Israeli government, whichever government it is, would protect itself and protect the 8 million Jews who live in Israel. I want to ask you one last question because I know you have to run, Eric. I have spent time in evangelical churches. I went recently to Guatemala with Latina Coalition for Israel. And I know that when I'm in these rooms and I feel the love for Israel and the love for the Jewish people, I just wish that there were more Jewish Americans with me in the room so they could feel it. And that's why I was so thrilled to be interviewing you today. What do you think we can do in terms of even more bridge building between the Christian and Jewish communities?
I think on the Christian side, keep it up. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep expressing unconditional love for Israel and the Jewish people. and making clear that it's a new day. It's a new day. We've had, in the past 2,000 years, a lot of ups and downs, to say the least, and a lot of missteps on the Christian side for sure. I'm speaking as a Christian. But this is, I think of CUFI, which has 10 million members. That's the first movement, and it is a movement in the 2,000-year-old history of the Gentile church that is openly and unapologetically supportive of Israel and the Jewish people. Ellie, we have never seen this before in the history of the church. So it's a new dawn today. So I think Christians, hey, keep doing what you're doing. Keep reaching out. The Jewish people in some cases are understandably apprehensive considering the history and sadly the anti-Semitism that we saw in the church over the years. But it really is a new day. And I just think if on the Christian side we keep at it and there's some openness on the Jewish side, this thing will continue to grow because it is a movement and it's a special thing happening for such a time as this, I believe.
When you say such a time as this, what do you mean exactly, Eric?
For the perilous times we are living in, and I believe really Bible times, and you're from Iran originally, Ellie, your heritage is in Iran. I think of Esther, the story of Esther, the biblical story unfolded in ancient Persia, which is modern day Iran. That's where that phrase comes from, where Mordecai said to her, who knows that you were born for such a time as this. Perhaps you were born for such a time as this. And in these times when Israel, in many ways, is more powerful than it's ever been and more stable, but threatened in many ways more than it's ever been. The threat of a nuclear Iran looming, anti-Semitism rising around the globe. For such a time as this, Israel, I believe, needs a few good friends, and I believe Christians can fill that role and really step up shoulder to shoulder with our Jewish brothers and sisters and be there through thick and thin. It's a new day. This is not the 1930s. It's a new day, and I believe Christians absolutely are also saying never again today, and will not be silent as these genocidal and anti-Semitic voices and forces rise up.
Eric, I'm just feeling so inspired hearing your words. I couldn't agree with you more. We're seeing a really worrying rise in anti-Semitism in every corner of the globe, and sadly right here at home in the United States, coming at us from the far left, the far right, and radical Islamist forces. And meanwhile, like you said, Israel is being threatened by the Iranian regime, which has said over and over again that it wants to wipe Israel off the map of the earth. So I just want to thank you for everything that you've done to support the Jewish people, to support the Jewish state, and the entire Christian community that stands by our side. We thank you, and we hope that this support will be ever flourishing. Thanks so much, Eric, for joining us.
Thank you, Ellie. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for all you do.
For thousands of years, the experience of Jews in Europe was one of oppression, pogroms, and eventually the Shoah, the Holocaust, in which the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews on the European continent. Given those facts, it's not surprising to me that there are many people in the Jewish world who are hesitant to receive the support of the Christian world. But here we are in 2021, and times have changed. As you heard Erick Stakelbeck say in this interview, the Christian community stands side by side with the Jewish people and with the Jewish state of Israel. And this is a community of millions of people, whether in the United States, Latin America, or around the world. I think that we've turned a new page in history, and I do hope that the Jewish people will understand that it's time for us to accept the friendship that the evangelical and Christian community provide to us. I promise to bring you more voices from the Christian and Muslim world who stand side by side with the Jewish people. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Global Perspectives. Join me again next time.